They laughed at the man in the old green jacket. They had no idea what that jacket had seen.
Chad Mercer built this gym on image. David Turner didn't fit the brand.
You really don't belong here, David.
Sorry, guys, I gotta go.
Then the doors opened, and a man in a plain gray polo walked in like he owned the room.
Sergeant Turner, stand up. I need everyone in this room to know who you are.
Sergeant David Turner stood perfectly still in the middle of Mercer Fitness, sweat cooling on the back of his neck, while 12 people stared at him and nobody said a word. And the strange part was, David wasn't the one who should have felt small in that moment, though everyone in the room, including him, still believed that he was. Let's go back to where this began. 6 months earlier, David had walked into Mercer Fitness for the first time, a modest gym wedged between a laundromat and a phone repair shop on the edge of town, because it was cheap, because it was close to the community center where he worked nights fixing boilers and broken door hinges, and because his doctor had told him that if he wanted to keep walking without a cane by the time he turned 50, he needed to start moving that old injury in his leg instead of protecting it. If you've ever walked into a room and felt like you didn't belong there, stick around, because this story might change how you see the next person you're tempted to judge. David had grown up outside a small town in Ohio, the son of a mechanic and a schoolteacher, the kind of household where you fixed what was broken instead of throwing it away, a lesson that would matter more than he ever expected. He'd enlisted at 19, trained as a combat medic, and spent the better part of 2 decades patching up men and women in places most people only saw on the news, until a roadside explosion outside a forward base left shrapnel in his left leg and ended his active service 2 years earlier than he'd planned. He came home quiet. He didn't talk about it, not to the men at the hardware store, not to his neighbors, not even much to his 9-year-old daughter Lucy, who he was raising alone since her mother passed when Lucy was 5. He kept a photo of his late wife tucked in his wallet and her dog tag on a chain under his shirt, and some nights after Lucy was asleep, he'd sit on the porch and just breathe, grateful simply to still be able to. The gym David kept to himself. He wore the same faded olive field jacket over his gym clothes every single time, the unit patches long since removed, not out of shame but because he'd stripped away anything that invited questions he didn't want to answer. He moved carefully because of the leg, lifted slowly and deliberately, and never once complained when his form looked awkward next to the mirror-polished regulars who trained there. That was when Chad Mercer started noticing him. Chad owned the gym, had built it up from a single rented room into a brand with his face plastered across every flyer in a 50-mile radius. And Chad had very particular ideas about what his gym was supposed to look like. David, limping through his sets in an old jacket, was not on brand. Started small. Chad would walk past David's station and make a comment loud enough for the regulars to hear, something about dead weight near the machines, or ask, with a laugh that wasn't really a joke, whether David had wandered in from the wrong building. The other members, mostly younger, mostly polished, would chuckle along because Chad was the kind of man whose approval mattered to them, and David would just nod, finish his set, and leave. Nobody stepped in. Not because they were cruel people, most of them, but because staying quiet was easier, and David never gave anyone a reason to think he needed defending. Week after week it got worse. Chad started timing his comments for when the gym was busiest, made David's slow, careful lifts into a running bit for regulars to laugh at, once even moved David's usual bench by accident, so David had to ask in front of everyone where his equipment had gone. And still David said nothing back. He came in, did his work, and left, because he had learned a long time ago that the loudest man in the room is rarely the one worth answering. If this story is landing with you so far, I genuinely love to hear which part hit hardest. It helps me know what stories to tell next. Then came the day everything changed. Lucy had come along that afternoon, waiting on a bench near the entrance while her father finished his workout, clutching a folded drawing she'd made of him. Not in his gym clothes, but in the uniform she remembered from an old photograph, medic patch and all, because to her, that was simply who her dad was. Chad spotted her watching and, maybe emboldened by the audience, decided to make his biggest show yet. He walked right up to David mid-set, arms crossed, sunglasses pushed up on his head, and loudly announced that David was bringing down the whole vibe of this place, and maybe it was time he found a gym more his speed. Some cheap community rec center, maybe, somewhere that wouldn't mind a man who could barely walk straight. The room went dead silent. David set down the weight, looked at his daughter watching from across the room, and for the first time in 6 months, stood up straight despite the ache in his leg, and simply said calmly, "I'll finish my set, and then I'll decide where I train. Not you." It wasn't loud. It wasn't a scene. But it was enough that Chad, thrown off by the lack of a flinch, opened his mouth to fire back something worse. And that was the exact moment the front doors opened. A tall man in his late 50s walked in, silver hair cut close and sharp, moving with a kind of upright, deliberate presence that made half the room instinctively straighten their own posture without knowing why. He scanned the gym once, and then his eyes landed on David, and his whole face changed. "Sergeant Turner," he said, loud enough for the room to hear, disbelief and something like joy cracking through his composure. David turned, and for a moment didn't recognize the civilian polo and slacks on a man he'd only ever seen in uniform. Until he did, and something in his chest, guarded for 2 years, finally loosened. "Colonel Abel," he said quietly. Chad, still standing there with his arms crossed, looked between them, confused. His confidence visibly deflating in real time. Colonel Frank Abel closed the distance and did something that stunned the entire gym. He came to attention and gave David a slow, deliberate salute. "At ease, Sergeant," he said, though David hadn't moved. "This man," Colonel Abel continued, turning to address the stunned room, "pulled me out of a burning vehicle outside a forward operating base with shrapnel still in his own leg, kept pressure on my wound for 11 minutes under fire until the medevac arrived, and never once let me see him panic. I am standing in this room today, walking, breathing, because Sergeant David Turner decided my life was worth more than his own safety." He was awarded the Silver Star for that day, though I doubt most of you have ever heard him mention it. The gym was utterly silent. Chad's mouth opened and closed, no sound coming out. His gold watch suddenly feeling very heavy on his wrist. Lucy, across the room, stood up slowly, the folded drawing clutched to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Not from sadness, but because for the first time, the whole world could finally see what she'd always known. David didn't gloat. He didn't even look at Chad. He simply turned to his old commanding officer and said, "You didn't have to do that." Colonel Abel put a hand on his shoulder. "Yes, I did. You never let anyone thank you properly. I wasn't going to miss the chance twice." Chad, for his part, didn't get shouted down or thrown out. Nothing so dramatic. He simply stood there, stripped of every ounce of the performance he'd built his gym around, and in the days that followed, something in him actually seemed to shift. He personally apologized to David, awkwardly and imperfectly, the following week, and quietly changed the way his staff was trained to treat every member who walked through the door, regardless of how they looked or how fast they moved. It wasn't a complete transformation overnight. People rarely change all at once, but it was a start, and sometimes a start earned honestly is worth more than a performance of instant redemption. David kept training at Mercer Fitness, still in the same faded jacket, still moving carefully because of the leg that would never fully heal. But people looked at him differently now, not with pity and not with mockery, but with something closer to respect they should have offered from the beginning, simply because he was a person who deserved it. The lesson in all of this is a simple one, though it's easy to forget. You rarely know the full weight of what someone else is carrying, and the quietest person in the room is very often the strongest one in it. So it costs nothing to offer basic respect to a stranger, because you never know whose sacrifice made your own comfortable life possible. Thank you so much for spending this time with us today. If this story moved you even a little, consider sticking around because we've got a lot more stories like David's still to tell.